I welcome you on behalf of INFOE, the Institute for Ecology and Action Anthropology. My name is Sabine Schielmann, and we're happy that you found a way here and to discuss on issues of forest landscape restoration and indigenous knowledge for forest and climate protection. First of all, some little organizational issues. We will record on tape as well as on video the panel discussion. The recording on tape will be used also for the Global Landscape Forum. Mrs. Reinecke will later on say a little bit more about it, how it's going, how we would like to, the outcome and or the points of discussion to feed into that, and how, so that it can be kept alive for another while after this day. And also we will record on video. For INFOE, we will create a blog on indigenous people's contribution to the SDGs and in particular to forest and climate protection. So of course there will be parts used, and before we publish it, the speakers will receive the drafts so they can object. So of course we have to go by prior informed consent before using information that we would like to publish. With this event, we are sort of following up on the so-called expert discussion we had last year here, almost exactly a year ago in the same room, on forest landscape restoration as an approach to reach SDG 15, as an approach for forest conservation, restoration, protection, and as well in the context of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. At the time last year, we were focusing on rights issues and tenure issues in forest landscape restoration. Yeah, because we had a feeling that more and more measures and programs of forest landscape restoration, explicitly also called as such, are coming up, even though they might have been existing for a while without being called or dedicated to forest landscape restoration, and because we had a feeling that there was not sufficient concern about rights issues in these measures. And today we would like to focus a bit more on indigenous peoples and local communities' contribution and participation in these measures, and also in particular the contribution of their knowledge and experiences in sustainably using the forests they live in light of the current processes going on at the UNFCCC, where local and communities and indigenous peoples platform has been established and is currently developed and discussed how it is going to work, and what are the objectives, how is it what will the mechanism be. Our indigenous colleagues are directly coming from a meeting which was just held at the World Conference Center on the platform, so they come with brand news information on how this process is unfolding. So we are happy that we have been able to gather experts from diverse fields, disciplines, forest conservation, nature conservation, indigenous peoples, experts in their region and on their issues, and from academia. I'm also happy that we have quite a number of students here who are interested in learning more about these issues. And as these two processes are unfolding, our question is, what does one have to do with the other? How can the platform, as it is developing, give input into the implementation or the design and the implementation of forest landscape restoration, also a bit out of the concern that perhaps the platform as a new sort of process being established within the UNFCCC, that it has cannot have yet sufficient links and connections to what is going on in practice and policy. So yeah, trying to see how can the platform and its work feed into these ongoing programs on forest conservation, forest restoration, and also to see, yeah, what are tricky issues, what are concerns regarding participation, regarding consideration of indigenous and local knowledge in these programs, and hopefully to contribute to avoid in repeating mistakes or shortfalls from other programs such as RED or other forest conservation programs. So as we look into the issue also from a sort of scientific researcher point of view, we will start today with a presentation and on the different discourses on forest landscape restoration, because it's kind of defined, but not everybody understands the same thing under forest landscape restoration. There's, from the point of view of forest conservation, what kind of forests, how are they going to be restored, where are they going to be restored, whose land is it, and all these questions are, as I understand, because I'm not a forest expert, are not the same, understood the same by everyone. So I welcome first Sabine Reinecke from the University of Freiburg, and she's also at the knowledge hub of the Global Landscape Forum, and will further tell us about her work and her project on the forest landscape discourses. One more thing, there's a participants list circulating, so if you might want to give it around the other way again to make sure that everybody, we were asking for nationality because the Stiftung Internationale Begegnung will fund the event if there's like 50% international participation. But we have no problem with that. So.
Ja, wahrscheinlich.
Ich gehe hier rüber und klicke dann, wenn Sie möchten. Ich kann gerne weiter, man kann das machen. Okay, gut.
Yeah, okay. A warm welcome also from my side. Sabine already introduced me very briefly. I'm actually a person with many heads. So I'm a researcher at a very classical university with a forestry focus, which is the University of Freiburg, where I'm located in the Forest Environmental Policy Department. But I also have a second hat, being the knowledge coordinator and the knowledge hub of the GLF, which is the Global Landscapes Forum. I think most of you, if you're into the subject of forest landscape restoration, have come across this bigger platform or partnership, which has this intention to really bring a lot of partners together on landscapes in its varied ways of making a contribution to sustainable development across the globe, so to speak. And that's also the reason why we are going to record today, because I want to also bring this to the Global Landscapes Forum, that this discussion here, which is a very valuable and needed discussion in the context of talking about landscapes, bringing this, sharing this with other partners so that they can really trace what has been discussed here and maybe even follow up on this with other projects or with events and so forth. But as Sabine said, I'm going to present today a bit insights from our current project, which is on forest landscape restoration, where we did a discourse analysis, so to speak, what people expect from forest landscape restoration, and I will focus a lot on this notion of local communities, on indigenous peoples, and what that idea is. I will also do a second thing, which is a bit of the academia head, I assume, and do a possibly a little bit provocative diving into concepts. So I'll talk a bit about principal questions like when and why should we actually consider indigenous knowledge? When should we actually include stakeholders that typically are not political actors? And what are possible ways of integrating these different ways of knowing, particularly related to the platform and in the context of forest landscape restoration that we're going to discuss today. But let's first start with the discussion of forest landscape restoration and this discursive landscape that we have explored. So I assume most of you have an idea of why it may be necessary to think of forest landscape restoration, what are benefits from that. So depending on the scientific estimates, and I'm not a natural science person, these are really figures that I have to also take from natural sciences, and the estimates are between 0.5 and 6 billion hectares worldwide. This is really huge areas that are said to be degraded, depending on what you define to be degraded. And that basically means they're not productive, or they're not as productively used as they could be. And most of the times this is a humanly induced situation. So something that humans have caused, soil degradation and so forth. And the ideal of this forest landscape restoration is that we end up with some sort of landscapes that may look like this. A kind of a mosaic of different land uses, a strong notion on forest in this forest landscape restoration. And these forest landscapes, they offer a lot of functions. They offer biodiversity, conservation for species at the brink of extinction. They have this mitigation potential, the carbon sequestration that is possible. Oh yes, please switch off the light and we can see better. And of course, with relation to communities, they also bring a lot of ecological, economic, social functions at the communal basis. And that's also important for the discussions that we're going to have about local communities, indigenous peoples as stakeholders. So what's at stake? And it's their livelihoods that we're talking about. But when we're talking in UN context, we very often have this broader picture of the objectives to be achieved regarding with these international agreements, like the agreements related to the Convention on Biodiversity, the SDGs, the Paris Agreement we very often have in mind, but also the Desertification Convention, so the little sisters of the UNFCCC. The interesting thing for us in the project was to see that forest landscape restoration actually is a very old concept. We can trace this back for even centuries that this has been done to bring degraded lands into something that is functioning again. And we see this massive amount of land that is degraded, underutilized, and we asked ourselves, why is it? Why is it not that forest landscape restoration is at broad scale and implemented massively? And we asked it in a social scientific way, asking for desires of people, of different stakeholders that they have when they think of FLR, forest landscape restoration. And I shall clarify that we are coming from a tradition in science that says that what people think and the words they do matter. So that's the idea behind discourse analysis. And the meaning of forest landscape restoration for people in ongoing debates is really what matters for what they do. Okay, so the understanding related to that. And this is research I would like to share with you that was done on REDD+, actually, and there's several other research done in this way that has elaborated the discursive landscape of REDD+ for different people. And what we typically found is 3 different discourses, so broader structures, if you want to say, about how people look at something like REDD+. So we have people that have this idea of markets, yeah? Carbon sequestration, something that you can sell on markets, and there is a win-win marketable approach tied to that, and it's a positive thing. At the same time, we may also find people that rather stress the governmentality of that. So that's called green governmentality, stressing the techno-managerial state that is planning and organizing the issue. In this way, we can really solve the issues that we have with forest degradation and deforestation, for instance. And then there is a third discourse. That's called civic environmentalism, which is more of a radical notion of, there is something like nature in its own value. And it's not right to commodify, for instance, nature. And this is a discourse that you may know in the context of local communities, how they perceive of forests, how they perceive of landscapes. And this idea that processes also should be organized in a bottom-up way, which is in contrast to a state-based idea of how we should organize processes. And with REDD+ and also CDM policies, what we have noticed is that this third discourse, which we very often found in local contexts, was disrespected a lot in the way how these mechanisms were designed and the discourse is driven forward. And they also explain in a way that we often found local resistance to CDM schemes, for instance, in particular contexts. And in the project, we also said, but how is it with FLR now? Is it the same situation? Do we still have this resistance to something like FLR at local level? Do we still have these dreams of market instruments being implemented in the landscape? Or has the discursive landscape changed? So I shall spare you the details of our research. This is just as an overview for you that we have investigated, I think, 34 different countries worldwide where we have talked to different people, 69 in total, coming from different backgrounds, development agencies, international organizations, NGOs, research consultants, but also government representatives and even private companies. And for one person, we didn't know who he was. But before telling you about these nation-based discourses, I would like to briefly outline what the international discourse, so to speak, is when we think of the discussions in the Global Landscape Forum, for instance, or the Bonn Challenge, which some of you might know, the Bonn Challenge, which has this idea of restoring 150 million hectares by 2020 and another 200 million 10 years later. And how forest landscape restoration is framed there or presented there is with two notions, one being restoring the ecological functionality, at the same time improving the human well-being, and having these two goals integrated in a certain way. It is not very specific of how exactly this is going to happen. Yeah, so it's not like with REDD+, you have to do it in a certain way in markets or whatever, but it's a broad understanding in principle, and in this understanding that particularly stresses the process. So it should be an adaptive process, learning, and participatory. So this is a notion that we find a lot in what is put forward in the international arena. When looking into the countries and seeing how different people see forest landscape restoration, and particularly what they would like to achieve with it, we find these different motives. And I have structured them a bit around these two broader ideas of human well-being on the one hand side and ecological well-being, which we have in the international discourse. And we see that at national level we have much more focus on human well-being. This is really something that we found in the data, a focus that is not so much climate co-benefit oriented like we would maybe have it with REDD+, but one that stresses rural development, livelihoods, poverty eradication, nutrition, health, and culture, but also in parts resilience are motives. And if there have been ecological considerations, we very often also have this notion that ecology for humans. So the services that ecological systems provide for humans, be it drinking water, fertile soils, and so forth, this is what really matters, but in parts also biodiversity conservation in its own right. So species conservation. A slight difference between different regions in the world. So African, Asian, European respondents rather stress this human well-being notion, whereas North American, Latin American respondents rather were to be found in the middle, so to speak. This is very rough, and in detail it would make a few differences, of course, but this is just for structuring. So conservation, adaptation aspects were not as important in the forest landscape restoration, but what was very interesting, at least for us, was when we asked people for the relevance of certain actors in these operations. So who do you think is the most important actor to bring this about? So changing the landscapes as they are, from degraded to some kind of restored. And local communities, especially with a focus on indigenous people, was, at least in our survey, something that was stressed a lot. 66 out of 69 respondents said this is either important, very important, or highly, very highly important. So we had a few categories, and then were really the highest categories in terms of importance for these processes. This is even more than government being important in these processes. So that's the views of the people of how forest landscape restoration should be implemented and what should be addressed with it. So coming back to this discourse landscape that we know from Red Plus already, and now interpreting it in the context of forest landscape restoration, we may say that it kind of is more centered. So this is not a radical view in forest landscape restoration where you say, yeah, bottom up and people involved in the process, maybe we don't need that, or nature is not so much of a, but it really has come to the center of the discussions to involve local people in forest landscape restoration. This is what is very often hidden behind integrated approach. In principle, yeah, on paper, in the discussions so far. But at the same time, we also have a little less market rhetorics, a little less, it's significant in the data we have, but what is still very strong is the state discourse. So that states, in terms of planning, land use planning, have a critical role in landscape restoration approaches. And this is something to be really critical also about in these discussions about local people, their integration in processes, that there is an understanding that these processes should be driven by states, while at the same time they wish they also be driven by local communities. Another question is, how do you get these two things together? So there's what we would call a reformist but still classical governmentality discourse, which tries to integrate these two almost dialectical ideas of how to govern, bottom up and top down at the same time. I would like to bring this later into the discussion, this dialectic that we find in forest landscape restoration, but before getting there, I would like to briefly go through a theory with you, a theory that is provocatively asking whether for any problem we actually need an integration of knowledge systems in governance. I'm not cynical here, and I also don't want to provoke too much, but from this theoretical approach, it is actually that not for every problem we need to integrate stakeholders. It's a very normal understanding in this concept that it really depends on the problem at stake. And I hope that you can actually see this. It looks not so good on this screen. There is some theory that differentiates between 4 different problem types. These problems can be differentiated according to whether we know or agree on the knowledge we have about the problem, and whether we agree in political terms on the values behind it. There are very simple problems that we call structured problems. They are also talked of as tornado problems. And just to guide you through this is the complexity that increases with these type of problems. So we have problems where we agree on the knowledge. We know what the problem is, and we know what we think about it, whether we like it or not. And we also agree that certain things are good. So with a tornado, you don't have to discuss whether to hide or not, you just hide. Yeah? It's the same with planes going down, crashing. the pilot says brakes or whatever it is, and you do what you do. And we know these kind of policies as well, tornado policies, where this is a simple situation. But we have other problems, and this is the most extreme one. It's the unstructured problem, where we have complete ignorance. That means the science is not clear, and we also do not agree on what we want. Yeah, so different objectives by people. So abortion is the prototype policy of this kind, but also many times when we think of climate change, genetically modified organisms, and the skepticism around this and the discussions, it seems like an endless debate. And that is because we have a situation where the science is not perfectly clear, and we also disagree on the values. And the moderately structured problems in between there is one where we know or we agree in terms of values of what we want. So we know we want, for instance, to avoid deforestation, but we do not agree on the means of how to get there. And we do not agree because we don't know which one has which result for this common objective, so to speak. And another sort of moderately structured problems is one where we cannot agree on what we want to achieve, but we know the different ways of achieving certain things. So the knowledge is all right, but we do not agree on what we want. So objectives may differ. Yeah? So some people dream of markets, yeah, of a wonderful capitalist system, and others just scare away from that idea. Yeah, they think this is not the world I want to live in. And this is also a debate rather on values than on facts and knowledge. This is something to keep in mind when it comes to how exactly would the governance institution, like a platform on indigenous knowledge, have to look like, depending on what problems you're debating. So with deforestation, wet blast, forest landscape restoration issues, we may agree in this group, I don't want to suggest this too much, that it is a lot about values in a way. Yeah, that to a certain extent we agree on much of the knowledge in terms of what markets may contribute, what indigenous people may contribute to the solution, but we may not agree on what to achieve. Who is going to benefit from things, right? This is just a suggestion, we may discuss this later. And then the question is, in such a situation, would we need indigenous participation in any case? I would say yes, in any case. So, while tornado politics allow for rational approach to governance, yeah, states plan, implement, don't ask, it's fine. These other problems, they ask for different ways of dealing with the problem. So, a moderately structured problem where we agree on what we want, but not on the means, is more of a negotiation process. You negotiate, so to speak, the means you want to implement to achieve your common goal. And because you don't know exactly whether it's the right mean, this becomes a certain political thing. Advocacy, science can play a role in that. Even indigenous people might have a nice contribution in terms of ideas, of knowledge. But when thinking about problems that are really where we don't agree on the values of what we want to achieve, what is good life, what is bad life, and have really extreme positions, which is this moderately structured problem in this corner, which may be something like red blast or forest landscape restoration in a way. Some would even say it's going up there. It's not that easy. You cannot just work with a negotiation setting. You have to leave that setting. You have to think anew the setting you're discussing knowledge and solutions in, because we're talking about values. Yeah? You have to find a way to reconcile particularly different positions on landscape, on forest, whatever. So the suggestion is twofold. So there's one that says, okay, accommodation. So you freeze the conflict. This may be a solution if the conflict is too broad. So you have two extreme situations, and there's no way to find a common ground to achieve something. This is not very satisfying because it actually means staying within the status quo in a way. Another alternative is more deliberative and interactive. So deliberation, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, is a really new way of doing democracy in a way. And it's not, you leave your own positions behind and you really try to deal with the issue at stake and try to find solutions together. Compromise and conflict management, that's the idea about it. And in an unstructured problem, which is the worst case, so to speak, it is even about starting a new thinking of the problem, learning together, because we don't understand the problem perfectly, but we also do not agree on what we want to achieve, which makes it very complicated and a muddy situation in a way. So thinking now about the local community and indigenous people platform as it is planned and implemented around UNFCCC, I asked myself, in how far is this something that corresponds with these ideas from science policy research? And the way most of the bodies and committees are organized in UNFCCC context, to me, look very linear in a way. So knowledge transfer. So the diagnosis is we miss relevant information, knowledge, to be informing some political process. So that's the linear model. Yeah. So we have. Let me show you this figure. Oh, can you see it? Yeah. So you have the facts on the one hand side. Could be even different types of knowledge, and this is informing the politics as agreed in the negotiations. And because you think this way, you can actually make this one setting. So one setting where we just discuss the knowledge, and then we make a check. Okay, this is the right knowledge we need, and then you just put it into the process. But this is not how you can deal with these problems. If values are concerned, it's not about facts anymore. It's about what people value and what they want. And what we see a lot in the context of IPCC, for instance, but also bodies even like IPBES, there's still sometimes this notion that knowledge is something that you just package and then you transport it with a report, yeah, with a report to the right person, and they know what to do with it. And there's no politics involved. Policy relevant, but not prescriptive. So this is how we do science advice, scientific advice, in many cases with this transfer model. And when you look at LCIP, this local community indigenous people body, again the discourse, what is transported in discussion, is a very nice one from theoretical point of view. So motives like learning are central, experience sharing. So really there's this notion of exchanging on par, dialogue. So that's pretty much in line with what theory would also say, this is how you should do it. IPCC also recognizes this is very relevant knowledge we need to learn. And that's corresponding in a way to what I just explained about the problem. So how the problem is structured, could be a way of dealing with it. But when looking into the negotiations, and I'm really happy that we have people that are inside these negotiations and can share with us a bit how it is planned in the terms of, because it's still under negotiation, how this exchange is going to be, whether this is learning. And you may agree to me that how you organize a setting and the discussions matters a lot for what the effect will be. Yeah? And I have many questions to this setting actually. So for instance, how is it linked to the real decisions? Is it something that in this transfer model comes first, somewhere in a separate setting? Or is there a way that we can also talk about values, for instance, about political interests, about what people wish and the objectives they have, for instance, in adaptation? Is it integration or is it transfer? So these are two different things and two different approaches that don't fit the same problem. Knowledge transfer is okay for tornado politics. It's not okay if we're talking about highly value-loaded issues. And then the question is, if it's separated, doesn't indigenous knowledge become this other way of expertise that is just brought to policy from a certain distance? Or do we have ways of how we can really discuss on par about what is useful knowledge, what is legitimate knowledge, and what people want? Another, possibly an even more provocative question that I would like to raise is, and you mentioned this before as well in a way, do we need the body at international level? Or do we also need this integration at other levels, and how could this also be linked? Yeah, across levels, how can we assure that different constituencies, different stakeholders really have a meaningful discussion and decision making together? So there's a difference between presenting knowledge and being involved in decisions. And it depends on how the setting is organized, whether we have a really meaningful participation in decisions or not. And this is something I would like to further discuss with you in the next minutes. I have also prepared a few more provocative slides, if necessary, about what is actually participation. When do we participate? When do we are we really involved in decision making, or when are we just in a therapy session, so to speak, where we as knowledge holders are kept silent through just being in a certain setting? So if there is some questions maybe related to the concepts that I have presented. I know it's a bit complicated sometimes when you come from the academia, it's all clear, and then you spit this at people that are not used to it. So I'm happy to directly react. Yes?
I think we are talking about, as I think the first, a big question is not there. And it's a good question would be, where is the problems come from? Why are we using the forest? Why are we why are we using water? And it's not a way of thinking. And that's a Western way of thinking. And we see always these problems were done by experts, scientists. And people used to learn that they don't learn until they learn a lot of years. And our possibilities are, our head and our thoughts are very, limited.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the people indeed called indigenous people doesn't forget. And I think it would be just good to first of all, who has to learn from who and why and who made the problem.
Yeah.
And then I think we can start to also don't forget that indigenous people are not special or lower or not. We are the same, and I think it's now a very right, mature time. It's very time to learn that our way to think and to live is cut up the world.
Yeah. I love your comment, actually. You're really shaking on my heart, because when I showed this, I tried to show you that when we're talking about deforestation, we're not here. We're not where states know everything and then they just can implement some planning, and that's fine. But we rather should go down the street and come to a problem situation which has the implication that we have to accept that knowledge is diverse and that all knowledge is relevant and matters. So, for instance, in this, because science doesn't know better either, indigenous knowledge is just as good or even sometimes better. We had this discussion earlier with Nidia today when she said there were these scientists coming to, which country was it, Peru, learning about a fish, and they found out, this fish has is a predator for six other fish. And then they asked the people, like, what do you know about the fish? And it was much more complex what they found out just by asking people, listening to people and accepting the value of their knowledge. And that's also what I tried with this typology to show. There is much more diversity in problem structure, and it also implies to really approach these problems differently from what we used to. And when I look at UNFCCC, I have really stomach ache with the setup when it comes to how can we accept or integrate and incorporate knowledges that are just as valuable. And it does not happen that you have somebody here and you let them talk, and then of course the decisions are directly transferred according to this knowledge. This is not how it goes, because these settings are prone with power relations, interests, and then if you have a group like indigenous people that are not known for being the most powerful and resourceful, we really have to think, how can we change the situation? How can we change the bias to have this knowledge being really relevant in the discussion, because it is relevant. That's what I wanted to show you. It's just as relevant. The science person in these situations where the values are at stake is worth nothing, or just as worth, so to speak, as any other kind of seeing and valuing things. Yeah. So you're speaking right to my heart. You're speaking right to my heart. Yeah. Other questions about this concept that I have introduced? If not, I'm happy to discuss this further in the panel discussion later. And yeah, feel free to also approach me in any way. I forgot to add the email, but we can always share. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Rodion Sulyandziga is Udega from Siberia, yes, and he's from the Eastern Siberia, and he's from the organization Center for Support of Indigenous Peoples of the North of Russia, and for a long time involved in the UNFCCC process, but also in his country and at his home for forest conservation and all the many issues that are confronting indigenous peoples.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Sabine, for inviting me to share and to deliver some kind of prospect from indigenous peoples. Because I should say we are in the right place, in the right time, being in Bonn today, because so far we are having a very tough negotiation between indigenous peoples and parties with regards to final decision on the indigenous peoples, local communities and indigenous people platform. So it's a very great momentum being with you today, and also to share what is going on. And I also would like to thank Sabine for the very impressive presentation and some kind of methodology and how to bring academia and science to such very complicated issue like climate change and others, because we need also strong involvement of scientists to help us and to provide some kind of good bridge between parties, social societies, indigenous peoples, and so on. So I will try to speak more simple language as a practical person, to be involved into the depths of the negotiation. And my main focus today will be to share with you our experience, how we are organized and how we are working under the UNFCCC as indigenous peoples, as a collectively. Just it's example why we are here, because climate change is now getting very, very relevant and useless at globe. So that's why United Nations and all parties are quite concerned how to deal with this issue, because according to global poll and national poll, climate change have a second ranking under the global new challenges. And of course, climate change negotiation has a long history and story, starting from 1992, from Sustainable Development first meeting in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, to identify potential sustainable development and so on. So it's a long story in history, and I should say that it's not only a political big process, but it's also a very technical process. And we should be very well organized and to learn more how it's going at the global level. But there are still, of course, big gaps between local and global. But again, that's why we're here, trying to bring our local prospect and prospect from indigenous peoples and communities. Just very briefly, how we are working on this UNFCCC. We are observers. We are not having right to make a decision because it's up to parties. But we are among the major groups, which is called constituency. We are having youth, business, and science, and many others. We are called Indigenous Peoples Constituency as one of the major groups. And I should say that we are quite well organized, working together between all 7 regions with Indigenous Peoples population. It's Asia, Africa, Arctic, Latin America, Northern America, Pacific, and Russian Federation and Eastern Europe. So we are all presented here to provide our one strong voice and strong solidarity. And between COPs, we are having Indigenous Peoples Global Steering Committee consisting all 7 regions representative. And at the COP, we are working under the Indigenous Peoples International Forum on climate change, or we call this caucus of Indigenous Peoples. So, and of course, we are having our own strategy, particularly how we would like to work with parties. That is our main target: to lobby and to deliver with them our main messages, concerns, and we used to arrange annual global dialogue with member states through the COP or prior COP. It's up to arrangement. And of course, we have a group which is called Friendly States towards Indigenous Peoples. It means that we are still having non-friendly states, but it's a part of our strategy and lobby. So it works, and we are still having bilateral negotiation with many friendly states. And of course, 3 years ago, in 2015, we came to a new global agreement on climate change, which is called now Paris Agreement, replacing Kyoto Protocol. So what is as a key essential elements? So it's for the first time bringing all nations to a common case to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change and adapt to its effects, with enhanced support to assist developing countries to do so. So it's provide a new global legal framework, how to deal with a new threat at globe like climate change impact. And it was a great recognition that climate change impact, meaning human being activity, not it's a natural phenomenon, but it's provided and accelerated by human and business activity. I think that is a key point that all member states have to accept. So, and of course, it provides a new requirement for all member states to report on a regular basis, which is called NDC now, and we are looking forward very much to be part of this national reporting system. And of course, we cannot solve any challenges, any problems, and how we can protect our lands, forests, not only by strong and good statements and agreement. We need, of course, strong, appropriate financial flows and commitment. That is, I think, also very key issue. And of course, a new technology framework, and also how we can increase all capacity building. Not just for community, but also for parties and for the national government to work together. And of course, it's most critical for us how the Paris Agreement reflects our demands, our needs, our challenges we are, as indigenous peoples are facing with. And I should say I'm personally quite satisfied with Paris Agreement text. Even it's not enough, but it's of course a compromising text, including different part of the Paris text reference to indigenous peoples, particularly to indigenous people rights. So and also with the decision to establish a platform to exchange of experience and sharing of best practices on mitigation and adaptation in a holistic way. So I think that is a key issue for us put into the Paris Agreement text. And of course, strong preference to traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, local knowledge system. It's also providing a new framework, particular for creation of local communities and indigenous peoples platform as a new venue for moving forward and implement the Paris Agreement. It just it was not so easy to lobby and to fight. It's not just a photo session. It's part of our strategy and lobby being in Paris 3 years ago to have top-level meetings, even with president, just to be more vocal, visible, and to have a direct channel to talk to policymakers and decision makers. So, and also, I think we were the only constituency allowed to make a peaceful strike in a blue zone, zone of negotiation, trying to urge parties to respect indigenous people rights. And there is some kind of picture from Paris meeting. So that was strong solidarity. And at that time, we also had a strong support from other constituencies, human rights organizations, and others. But again, it was not so easy work. It was very tough job at that time, and still. So, and this picture from Marrakesh, because Marrakesh was also so critical for us after Paris, because it was already phased to implement Paris Agreement commitment and to develop a new framework, particularly for the platform. So it's also we are trying to use arrange press conference for mass media, for public, to be more visible and visible. And now we finally are coming to platform. Sabine already mentioned there are three key milestones of functioning. Yes, it's a knowledge, it's a capacity building engagement, it's a policy action. So how it should be working in practice is still a challenge. But today we already received the first draft of the SABSTA proposal. And we already had 2 rounds of informal consultation, and we are allowed as observers to be a part of such kind of consultation. Even we have right to have flow and to deliver our message and recommendation. So, and I should say, the first draft it looks quite good from our point of view. But let's see what happens tomorrow, because there are still some countries that raise different kind of concern and issue, like for instance China, Indonesia, and Brazil. And we can accept that there are still some kind of challenges raised by some countries. For instance, we should keep and reserve place for local communities under this platform. To make some kind of balanced approach, and also how we can merge science and traditional knowledge together, not to contradict, but also to have two valuable contribution in one box. So, and also how to link local and global, including of course national level. There is still, I think, a gap. We should think more and trying to minimize this gaps between three levels. And but what we came already, I think, to agreement between all 7 regions and parties that we confirm that we all would like to create facilitative working group as a bridge between the process what we are having now to the full operation of platform for next 2-3 years. And we also agree, I hope, with the general composition of this working facilitation group having equal approach, 7 indigenous peoples and 7 parties representatives. And also, one of the main tasks of the facilitation working group will be to develop modalities for action plan for next 2 or 3 years. So, but again, we will see what happens tomorrow and next week. But we are working hard between us. We don't want to submit individual regional proposal. What we would like to do, to submit one voice and one position paper to parties in order to compromise with parties. And of course, we will continue our lobby working with friendly and non-friendly states, how we could compromise. But I'm thinking positively, and tomorrow we will have our own caucus to discuss and to follow up. And then I hope next week there will be a final decision on the platform. I think it's also quite critical to look at indigenous people's key principles, which provide a baseline for moving forward. It's of course human rights-based approach, particularly on the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a minimum standard for indigenous peoples, and of course full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, equal status, self-selection based on the regional processes, and of course to have adequate funding to fulfill this effective participation. I already mentioned that it's just a key component of the working facilitation group, how we would like to see in the future. With regards to meeting, we agreed, and parties, it seems, also agreed to have at least minimum 2 meetings per year during the intersessional meeting in Bonn and also during the COP itself. And also very briefly, because one of the key issues today is also forest. And we know that it was a big attention to tropical forests under the RED program in previous. And one of our tasks also through the global negotiation was to bring the issue of boreal forest, because boreal forest is also playing a key role in terms of adaptation, mitigation, emission and greenhouse effects. So, and we are quite satisfied that Paris Agreement recognizes the value of all forests, including boreal, of course. You know that Russia and Canada are having the biggest boreal forest in the world, and which have a great role also for the climate change and mitigation and adaptation. But also, and there is another issue. It's not covered by today's meeting, but it's a big issue. I think we should keep in mind. It's Paris Agreement provides a very strong framework to switch economy based on the extractive industry to green economy based on renewable energy. So for us it's a good signal, and I think it's a strong signal also for many countries. So and it's another kind of big topic and debate, very important for indigenous peoples. And also, of course, again, we cannot solve problem of our forests and lakes just providing strong statement and good agreement. We need fund for implementation, and we need strong commitment from all levels, of course, including budgets. And also the role of Green Climate Fund, we should keep in mind, because now it's having more role under the global climate process. Yes, I think this is my final slide.
Okay, welcome and thank you for the invitation to be part of this event. My name is László Maráz. I studied forestry in Germany but didn't work really in forests, but I'm a co-founder of other NGO, Rodion in Munich. We were working also sometimes with indigenous people. I'm proud of it because we were able to help the Macuxi people in northern Brazil to get the soil territory acknowledged. But now I'm working in forest, German and international forest policy issues, dialogue, platforms. But today I will raise the questions and ask you to the panelists a few questions. And we have 3 questions, and for the first it's for Susanne, Hassan and Catherine. And we have like maybe 5 minutes for each of you to answer. It's first question is, please introduce yourself first and your activities regarding forest landscapes restoration. And what point to the what significance do indigenous communities and their experiences in theory and practice have for forest and climate protection as part of your work? So your work and the significance of indigenous people's work. Start please, Susanne.
Okay, so how do we organize that? I stay here or?
No, I stay here and I switch on.
Okay, I stay here and you.
Yeah.
Okay, so 5 minutes. So I have brought some slides with me. My name is Susanne. I studied forestry also in Germany, and I worked at universities for 15 years to study forest ecology and to see how forest management could be adapted to improve forest biodiversity and to maintain forest biodiversity. So I'm not specialized in indigenous people questions, but nevertheless at WWF we are working on forest landscape restoration, and so I'm responsible for forest landscape restoration in our organization. And For this moment, I have the interim coordination of forest landscape restoration for the global working WWF, so not just for WWF Germany, but for the whole working group. It's called ACA, Area of Collective Action and Innovation on Forest Landscape Restoration. Okay, so what we are doing, we try to develop projects on forest landscape restoration in Indonesia, in East and Central Africa, and South America. So the next, please. So I would say our main purpose is to maintain forests, and so for sure we need all the stakeholders on board, and there are different ways to get the result, as we already heard from the first presentation. And so the local communities and the indigenous peoples and the NGOs have very often the same purpose. So we want to maintain a sustainable used forest. And I would say we have three, for sure even more, but three main approaches to do that. So the first is the combination of indigenous territories to maintain the forest. The other one is from the more or less known work of nature conservation organizations to have protected areas to establish them. Sometimes that fits well together, and for sure there's a big discussion on the impact on indigenous peoples and how this can be done in the proper way. The third on forest landscape restoration, so there we want to restore deforested and degraded forest landscapes at scale, and so for sure this is from the first slide we have seen large devastated landscapes that should be restored under the Bonn challenge. And the third is to improve forests, so how to get better management and how to have a better carbon sequestration and so on. So improvement of forests, and one for sure you all know, red and indigenous red is a very important topic for us in South America. So next, please. So, as I already mentioned a little bit, so indigenous and local communities and NGOs very often are quite natural partners together. And so that's why we cooperate. Just to introduce a little bit what we are doing, we cooperate with indigenous and local communities in a lot of ways in different projects. The next. And if you're interested in that, we have just published a new forest report. I'm very sorry it's in German, but we also have an English one. This is called WWF Forest Living Report. And this is a very, very big 5-chapter long, I don't know, some hundreds of pages in English. But this is a new one in German where we always try to summarize the trends for the different regions, for the global perspective from the continent, core areas, and what happens with the forest cover there, and what kind of projects and approaches are not only WWF, but where is the solution for these parts. Okay, so the next please. Inside this report, we also shortly represent some work, for example, as from your home. So, indigenous people from Far East, for example, stand in front of a harvested area, and so for sure, this is just as the example that the harvesting and the approaches to use the forest clashes, especially with the needs of local communities and big companies. So I think this is, you asked for the reasons why all that happens. For sure, the wood demand is so increasing. It's an incredible increase
would demand that the companies for sure want to use this wood, as you know. Okay, so that's one problem. We have a big tiger program there on, I think, 13 countries, together with all these governments up to the local communities. Next, please. The Bakar, we have a big project. The Zanga project started in 1990, and this is in the Central African Republic, and the area is a little bit less than 7,000 square kilometers. And so there, next please, is a hunting zone established, and this hunting zone means that the Bakar, the indigenous people, can use the forest as in their traditional way, and the hunting means that it's only allowed to hunt in a traditional way, not by guns and so on. That for sure creates some problems sometimes, and there were some rebels some years ago, and so they started to hunt elephants inside, and finally now the conflict is a little bit smaller now, and there's a certain cooperation between these Bakar and the rebels now, but nevertheless, so this is a continuous work of not only WWF, but with a lot of partners in this region. The next one, please. So, one very important question with regard to forest landscape restoration is, so we all for sure use FPAC as a safeguard to work with local communities, but the question is this enough? And I think it's not enough, because the Bonn challenge that pushes forest landscape restoration is a very open, encouraging process, I would say. The general aim is to get more forests, to sequester more carbon, for example, and for sure to increase livelihood. But I think there are a lot of approaches that finally could increase conflicts in the regions. Because if you want to restore forests in such a large scale of 350 million hectares, for sure you need some bankable projects to do all that. And we are not against that, but I think it's very important for an NGO. Perhaps not for the whole process, because the encouragement to increase the forest cover is quite necessary without limitations, I think. But when we as a nature conservation organization start to work within this approach, we need more safeguards and methodological frameworks to be sure that a project at a more large scale do not increase conflicts of the local communities, and there are already the first indications in some areas that this might start. So that means for WWF we need safeguards, and we want to develop. We do not have them. We have the safeguards for the RED process, and I think a lot of safeguards can be used. But nevertheless, it's not adopted for forest landscape restoration. Okay, so we need more ecological and social impact studies on forest landscape restoration, how that works. Next. So perhaps I need more than 5 minutes, huh? So I can, huh? No, I do not have the time now. Please indicate when I have to stop. But I can do it a little bit faster. The question is learning, sharing, and respecting I think forest landscape restoration could be a very good possibility to clarify land rights and to share knowledge. And I think it's really the key question for forest landscape restoration, to do it in a very good ecological and social way to improve the forest, to use this knowledge. If not, we will have less diverse and monotonous forest or something like that. Okay, so the next. This is, I think it's a very important statistic that shows for the Amazon region that protected areas, so this is the blue bars, and the red are the indigenous territories. And you can see that for the Amazon region, nearly 50% of these areas under the management of indigenous territories. And there are some, from the history, there are some times where more or less numerous indigenous territories are established, and in other years more or less only protected areas. And so for taking that together, I think it's very important to have these combined to have a response against the threats coming from globalization. So we found out that especially in South America, the legal frameworks are mainly developed by for sure, governments and citizens with a background of cities, and so these are not adapted anymore to the local people and the indigenous peoples, and so this is totally not in line what nature conservation and indigenous communities would like to have. Okay, so what?
Could we stop here?
Yes?
And with the other questions you could maybe
Yes. So
forward.
yes. So this is really the first part. The second is on climate change and the
If you have the time.
solution. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you very
yeah.
much. And then I would invite Susanne to also for an answer to this question introduction. How are you working with indigenous people? So the question is like how your activities regarding forest landscape restoration are including the
Good afternoon. My pleasure to be here, part of the panelists. I'm Pasang Dona Sherpa from Nepal. I work for Center for Indigenous People Research and Development called CIPRED. I have been working in the area in issues of concerns of the climate change and forest landscape, and also in relation to the traditional knowledge and customary institutions, how it has been contributing for sustainable management of the natural resources, our hidden practices, and our biodiversity and ecosystem in the past 9 years. We are also maybe you can say that. And we are also the members of Asia, partners of Tepteba, and that has linked us to share our experience on the ground in the global forum too. As we are aware, the different research has already shown that indigenous peoples, not only in Asia or in my country, but across the globe, how it has been contributing for sustainable management of the natural resources ecosystem, and through our own customary institution, our governance systems, and our own knowledge and cultural practices. So this is what I will be sharing a little bit how it has been in the context of Nepal also. Through our customary institutions, like me, I'm Sherpa, indigenous groups in Nepal, especially from the mountains, and we have our own customary institution called NAWAS. And NOAS has its own governance system, governance practices, our own rules and regulations, and which is far, far better than protected area norms and values that have been guided from the forest laws and policy acts. So similarly, 59 indigenous groups in Nepal, which has been recognized from the government of Nepal, and more indigenous groups are in the process to be recognized. They have their own customary institutions. So it is very important to understand and next please, understand how they have been really contributing, how it has been really contributing for climate change resilience, especially by protecting forests and natural resources, biodiversity. So this is just one example that what we have been doing on the grounds in the middle of the one. But this slides I just borrowed from my other presentation. But we have been also working a little bit further up in the mountains now, collecting the healing practices of indigenous knowledge, which are still not influenced from the modern practices of medical treatments. So how it has been, actually my organizations have been documenting and doing a lot of research and also feeding to the governments, and trying documents as a backbone for advocacy and lobby to ensure that how important it is for government policy and programs to be recognize the indigenous knowledge practices that has been in fact contributing. Can you go a little bit further down? This is just the, and then so the different research has already shown. You can see here a little bit down that indigenous knowledge actually contributed for climate change adaptation and mitigations. So different research I just compiled here already prove so that it has been really contributing. But if you go next one please, and then this is just examples that how Dura communities in one of the areas where we have been still working on how traditional customary institutions monitoring the status of the forest governance and natural resource management despite the limited numbers, but has been really contributing for the intact of the forest and protecting the sources of the waters, how still not free from the impacts of climate change. my slides almost finished. Okay, and can you put the next one? So this is just a glimpses of few pictures of the Dura communities and then their livelihoods and the women's, and then how we have been trying to documentations of the their knowledge systems practices. Next please. And this is also one of the villages, which is you can see the forest at the back and the cultivations. Yeah. So I stop here, or I just continue 2 slides, 1 or 2 slides more. Yeah. Because I don't want to just speak out. Okay. Yeah. So, as Nepal is 4th vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change, and then the indigenous peoples are forefront of the climate change impacts, because the nature of indigenous peoples living in the mountains, close to the forests, and the fragile ecosystems. So they are in the forefronts of the impacts of climate change because of the changing patterns of the rainfalls and extreme weather, droughts, and melting ice of the mountain Himalayas and bursting stage. So that is why next one. That is why it is. Oh, this is the one? I thought it was the next one. Okay, yeah. So that is why it is very important that we document our knowledge, value systems on the ground and feed to the governments at the national level, as well as at the community levels, local levels, and in this kind of forum here in the UNFCCC. That to acknowledge, recognize why indigenous peoples on the ground really contributing for addressing the climate change impacts, despite the fact they are very unknown the causes of the climate change. Next, please. Yeah, this is just some of the glimpses that what we have been doing on the grounds. So yeah. So this is on the different research also shows that that we have been contributing for adaptation and mitigation to the impacts of climate change, but indigenous peoples are not in the mainstream of decision-making process to speak out their issues and concerns. So it is important that to adopt a holistic approach and also acknowledging indigenous knowledge and contribution on the same forum as the science. So that is why, the next please, that is why we need this forum. And then this is the forum that, as our brother Rodion just shared this morning, that the LC platform is not the out of blue moons. It is a long, long struggle for indigenous peoples. I started with following the negotiation of climate change since 2009. In the middle, I was almost away for three years, from 2015 to recently. And I could see the changes, right from the beginning when I was in the negotiation, like the status of indigenous peoples, even just to insert the indigenous peoples in the text. We really had to follow these government delegates on their footsteps, and there was no way out for indigenous peoples to be on that forum. But this is the outcome of our long struggles that now the suggestion for indigenous peoples to be on the same level actually is becoming realistic on the ground, despite the fact that we are not free from the challenges, to acknowledge our knowledge systems, our contributions, and reflect it in the policies and programs and implementation at the global, national, and local levels. Yeah. So this is my last slide. Yeah. And if you could go a little bit down. Yeah, just the reference, some of the references. And next one, please. Next one. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Me, I'm Colombian and work in the University of Bologna in Italy. And I have spent the time in Mainz, in Deutschland, in Germany, thinking and studying indigenous people when I wrote my PhD. Now I'm working a lot on understanding the contribution of indigenous knowledge to forest policies. I have wrote some articles that I can share with you. One of them really give recommendation to how to improve RED policies and have been accepted in a Forest Policy and Economics journal. You can have a copy if you need. And I will go with just the first question of the panel, just to replay. And the first question is there. What does UNFCCC office, local communities and indigenous people platform have to do with forest landscape restoration? So in order to answer this question, and in order to understand better my research, what I have done is using a lot the information of NGOs and organizations that have been working with indigenous people for a long time, and also using the time I have spent with indigenous people in Colombia when I did my PhD and also after. And in any way, translate this perspective and this work, that means spend a lot of time with people and with organizations, understanding the way they live, and bring it to other places, like academy, like policy, that seems to be much more formal, much more institutional, using a top-down perspective. That was the challenge of my research. And in doing this, for example, in this paper I have mentioned now, we identify one definition. That I did this paper with Heike Schroeder, that is professor in the University of East Anglia. And one of the conclusions is why we don't try to understand better complementary definition of forest. So if we see there is a foul definition of forest. This foul definition defines forest as an area with trees over 5 meters high and with a land coverage of canopy higher than 10% of the area. So maybe if we look in this, maybe it's more this, what is forest for foul definition. But if we ask and indigenous people is maybe this, is maybe also this that have a healing in themselves, because forests with people, there is one important fact in including indigenous knowledge in forests, and is that 80% of biodiversity over the world have been kept in indigenous territories. What tell us today this? Remote sensing. Remote sensing today tell us 80% of biodiversity is in indigenous territories. This is a fact. So indigenous people knows how to take care of forests. So this is one important element. The other is this one. So what do you see in this picture? We have just 5 minutes. What do you see in the picture?
Green color. Green color.
Green color, where the forest is? In diversity, is the forest here? Is the forest there? It's here. Who did this graph? Sorry, go on. No. We want to share this first. So this is the farm, and this is the forest. In the farm, we find 35 species of different plants. Forest is here, but there is a reason why this is like this. And this has been made by this indigenous person, Abel Rodriguez. He's an Ojuna indigenous person of the Amazonian. And he draws this and get a prize, a Crown Prize in 2014 for these drafts in watercolors that he makes. And this has been used to communicate other indigenous people how to take care of forests. So, in his work, here is in Spanish, and here is in English, I have translated. To manage chakra is the farm of indigenous people, the place where they live. They are in forests and they have no supermarket, they don't go for work. They work in the chakra, they live in the chakra, they enjoy the chakra, they feed from chakra. Chakra can be defined as a farm, but it's far away from this. So how can we understand what it is? He says, to manage the chakra means managing forests, since there is a clear continuity between chakra and forest. Indigenous people don't divide. Indigenous people go in a flow way. Chakra and forest are not incompatible definitions. Chakra and forest are a clear continuity. Indigenous people borrow land for a time to cultivate and then most of leave it to become a forest again. This using different phases of recovery. So in the narrative he used, he explained other indigenous people how to go and get this farm. This is a process that has not started one time and end in a circular time. These 35 parts or species took between 4 to 9 years to grow. So they have a special order that has been shared with other people. They start from some species, wait that this species develop and complement with other. No? There is a difference in timing and in spacing. So the first answer to my question, to this question of what forest landscape restoration is, it has to do for me with this. Currently, UN policies dedicate policies understanding forests as we see in the beginning. But forest is far away from this. We want to concentrate in the rights of indigenous people, or we want really to understand how we can share other spaces, like, for example, complementary definitions. If we want to go to the other option, for me, forest landscape restoration is one channel because it can include multifunctional functions in forests. So this allows us to recognize biodiversity, conservation, but also mitigation, and also include livelihoods in what mitigation of forest is. And this is the